At 11:20 on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Culin stood beside a burning Sherman tank in a Normandy field, 3 miles southeast of Carentan, watching smoke pour from the turret hatch where the loader had died 6 minutes earlier. 29 years old, 37 days in Normandy, 11 tanks lost in his battalion. The German 75mm anti-tank gun had been hidden in the hedgerow 70 yards away. The Sherman had tried to climb over the earthen bank. Standard procedure. The tank bellied up, exposed its thin underside armor, and the German gunner put one round through the hull before the crew could react. 3 men burned, 2 escaped. The pattern repeated itself across every field in the Norman bocage. By mid-July, First Army had lost over 200 Sherman tanks in 6 weeks. The 3/4 of those crews who survived knew the odds. British operational research confirmed what every tank commander already understood. 60% of Sherman losses came from a single shot. 73% of penetrated tanks caught fire. The Sherman 75mm gun could punch through a hedgerow, but not before the tank climbed over it. And climbing meant death. The Norman hedgerows were 4 centuries old. Farmers had stacked rocks along property lines, earth accumulated, vegetation took root. By 1944, the bocage stretched across 50 miles of countryside. Each hedgerow stood 4 to 15 feet high, built on earthen berms with root systems dense as steel cable. Fields measured 300 feet across. Sunken roads connected them. German defenders turned every field into a fortress. American tactics called for combat engineers to blow holes in hedgerows with 50-pound explosive charges. The blast attracted immediate German attention. Tankers tried bulldozer blades welded to Sherman bows. Effective, but only 60 dozer tanks existed in Normandy. Units invented rake teeth from railroad ties. They worked sometimes. Most hedgerows required multiple attempts. Most attempts drew anti-tank fire. Culin had watched 23 Shermans burn in his sector since June 6th. He knew the numbers. The 3rd Armored Division entered Normandy with 232 tanks. By late July, they would lose 648 Shermans destroyed, another 700 knocked out and repaired, a 580% loss rate. Every crew knew someone who died climbing a hedgerow. The problem consumed First Army planning. General Bradley needed a breakthrough. Operation Cobra would launch in 12 days. The attack required armor moving fast through bocage country. Tanks stuck on hedgerows meant German anti-tank guns picking off Shermans one by one. The entire offensive could stall in the fields. Culin walked the Normandy beaches on July 12th during a 24-hour break from the line. Omaha Beach still showed evidence of the June 6th assault, wrecked landing craft, destroyed bunkers, and thousands of German beach obstacles the engineers had cut apart and dragged above the tide line. Steel crosses, Belgian gates, and Czech hedgehogs. 3 steel I-beams welded together, each angled 90 degrees from the others. The Germans had placed them to stop landing craft. Now they sat in piles, scrap metal nobody wanted. Culin looked at the steel beams, looked at the hedgerows 3 miles inland, and understood what nobody else had seen. If you want to see how Cullin's steel teeth turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Culin. He returned to his unit on July 13th, found a welding torch, cut 4 prongs from a demolished Czech hedgehog, and by 0300 on July 14th, he had welded them onto the bow of his Sherman in a configuration nobody had tried before. By dawn, General Bradley would be watching a demonstration. By noon, Culin would either be court-martialed for destroying Army property, or he would change how tanks fought in Normandy. The difference depended on whether his pitchfork idea worked or exploded. At 0700 on July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley arrived at a test field near St. Lo, where Major General Leonard Giroux had assembled staff officers around a modified Sherman tank. 4 steel prongs jutted from the bow at 45-degree angles. Each prong measured 3 feet long, cut from German Czech hedgehog obstacles. The welds looked crude. The concept looked insane. Bradley commanded First Army. 30,000 men depended on his ability to break through the bocage before Operation Cobra launched on July 25th. Every previous solution had failed. Explosive charges worked but drew fire. Dozer blades worked but only 60 existed. Tank losses averaged 15 per day. The offensive needed armor moving cross-country, not dying on hedgerows. The modified Sherman backed up 50 yards from a hedgerow that stood 12 feet high with roots 6 feet deep. Standard bocage. the kind that had killed hundreds of American tankers since D-Day. The tank commander gave the signal. The Sherman accelerated to 10 miles per hour and drove straight at the earthen wall. The steel prongs hit first. They dug into the base of the hedgerow instead of riding up over it. The tank's weight pushed forward. The prongs acted like tusks, ripping through roots and earth. The Sherman plowed through the hedgerow in 8 seconds, emerged on the other side under a canopy of dirt and vegetation, and kept moving. The belly armor never exposed. The gun never stopped pointing forward. The tank remained combat effective throughout the breach. Bradley watched a second demonstration, then a third. Each time the Sherman punched through without climbing. Each time the crew stayed protected. Each time the tank could have engaged enemy positions on the far side immediately. The pitchfork configuration worked because it attacked the hedgerow at ground level instead of trying to climb over it. Bradley understood the implications instantly. If every Sherman in First Army could mount these prongs, armor could move through bocage country at fighting speed. Tanks could flank German positions by cutting through fields instead of using roads. The entire tactical situation would reverse. But Operation Cobra launched in 11 days. First Army fielded over 1,200 medium tanks. Building devices for all of them seemed impossible. Bradley turned to Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Medeiros, First Army's ordnance officer. The order was simple. Every ordnance unit in the Army would work around the clock producing hedgerow cutters. The steel would come from German beach obstacles. The design would follow Culin's prototype, and every cutter needed to be installed before July 25th. Medeiros calculated the numbers during the drive back to headquarters. 500 devices minimum to equip 60% of First Army's Shermans. Maybe more if production went well. 11 days to design, fabricate, transport, and install. No existing supply chain. No technical drawings. No standardized parts. Just scrap metal from Omaha Beach and every portable welding torch in Normandy. The production order reached ordnance workshops across the beachhead by 1400 hours on July 14th. Engineers at each workshop received the same instructions. Find German beach obstacles. Cut them into prongs. Weld them onto Sherman bows in sets of 4 or 5. Make them strong enough to punch through centuries-old root systems, and make 500 of them in 11 days. The 1st 111th Ordnance Battalion began cutting Czech hedgehogs that afternoon. The steel was harder than expected. Each hedgehog yielded enough material for 2 cutter sets. The welds required precision, or the prongs would snap under combat stress. And nobody knew if the design would actually work in sustained field operations under fire. By midnight on July 14th, 12 cutters had been fabricated. By dawn on July 15th, 38 more were ready for installation. The race had started. But 500 devices in 11 days meant completing 1 cutter every 30 minutes, 24 hours per day, with no breaks and no failures. And the German 7th Army was preparing counterattacks that could destroy the entire production effort before a single Rhino tank rolled into combat. By July 17th, ordnance workshops had completed 114 hedgerow cutters, 3 days of production. Crews worked 18-hour shifts. Welders burned through electrodes faster than supply trucks could deliver them. The portable forges ran constantly, and the Czech hedgehogs scattered across Omaha Beach were disappearing into Sherman modifications at a rate of 40 obstacles per day. The installation process took 90 minutes per tank. Engineers positioned each Sherman over a wooden framework to access the bow plate. 4 or 5 prongs were aligned at precise angles, then welded directly to the hull armor. The welds had to penetrate deep enough for structural integrity, but not so deep they compromised the armor plate. Each cutter added 800 pounds to the Sherman's weight. The tank's suspension handled the load, but commanders worried about mechanical strain during extended operations. Field testing revealed problems nobody had anticipated. The first 20 Rhino tanks deployed to forward positions near Perrières on July 18th. Company commanders reported the cutters worked perfectly in demonstration conditions, but showed vulnerabilities in combat. German anti-tank gunners quickly learned to target the prongs themselves. A 75mm armor-piercing round could shear off a prong and send shrapnel into the tank crew. 2 Shermans lost cutters to direct hits before engaging a single hedgerow. Engineers reinforced the welds, added gusset plates, increased the steel thickness on new cutters, but each modification added time to the production schedule. The rate dropped from 50 cutters per day to 38, and Operation Cobra required at least 500 devices installed by July 24th, the day before the offensive launched. The math was failing. Weather complicated everything. Rain on July 19th flooded the ordnance workshops near Isigny. Equipment got soaked. Welding torches malfunctioned. Production stopped for 6 hours while crews rigged tarps and relocated forges. The delay cost 23 cutters. And First Army's timeline had zero flexibility. Bradley had scheduled the offensive around weather forecasts that predicted clear skies for air support on July 25th. If the Rhino tanks weren't ready, the entire operation would proceed with conventional Shermans dying on hedgerows. By July 20th, 206 cutters had been installed on tanks across First Army. Progress, but not enough. The 2nd Armored Division needed 160 devices to equip 3/4 of their medium tanks. The 4th Armored Division needed 112. The 6th Armored Division needed another 94. And newer units arriving in Normandy wanted cutters before deploying to combat zones. Medeiros requested additional ordnance battalions from England. Schaeff denied the request. Every available welder was already in France. The solution had to come from within Normandy's limited resources. Workshops began operating 24-hour shifts with crews rotating every 8 hours. Welders worked until their hands blistered. Engineers cut hedgehogs until the torches overheated. The German 7th Army detected unusual activity around American tank formations. Reconnaissance patrols reported modified Shermans with steel protrusions. Intelligence officers couldn't determine the purpose, but assumed the modifications related to the expected offensive. Panzer Lehr Division moved anti-tank guns into positions covering likely breakthrough routes. The 2nd SS Panzer Division repositioned south of St. Lo. Both units received orders to prioritize destroying modified American tanks. On July 21st, a Rhino Sherman from the 29th Infantry Division engaged a hedgerow under fire near Saint-Jean-de-Day. The cutter worked. The tank breached in 7 seconds and destroyed a German machine gun nest on the far side. But a Panther tank 300 yards away hit the Sherman's right track before it could reverse. The crew evacuated. The Rhino burned. And German tank commanders learned the modified Shermans were still vulnerable to flank shots during the breach itself. By midnight on July 21st, 289 cutters had been installed. 4 days remained. 211 devices still needed fabrication and installation. And intelligence reports confirmed the Germans were preparing major counterattacks that could overrun the ordnance workshops before production finished. At 04:30 on July 22nd, German artillery struck the ordnance workshop complex near Colombières. 17 shells landed within 200 yards of the welding stations. 3 portable forges took shrapnel damage. 2 supply trucks carrying Czech hedgehog sections exploded. 4 welders suffered wounds. Production stopped for 3 hours while crews evacuated casualties and relocated equipment to secondary positions farther from the front line. The German bombardment wasn't random. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had identified the concentration of Sherman tanks waiting for modifications. 7th Army artillery plotted firing solutions. The workshops became priority targets. Every shell that landed near the production areas delayed the schedule, and the schedule had already failed its targets twice. By noon on July 22nd, 321 cutters had been installed. 179 devices remained. 3 days until Operation Cobra. The production rate needed to increase to 60 cutters per day. Current capacity maxed out at 45. The mathematics showed certain failure unless something changed. Medeiros ordered workshops to strip cutters from damaged Shermans and reinstall them on operational tanks. The policy made sense tactically, but devastated morale. Crews watched burnt-out Rhino tanks get cannibalized for parts, while their own Shermans waited for modifications. Tankers understood the logic. They hated it anyway. Every salvaged cutter represented a crew that died before the breakthrough even started. German pressure increased along the entire 1st Army sector. Panzer Lehr Division launched a counterattack near Pont-Hébert on July 23rd. American positions held, but the fighting pushed back the front line 800 yards. 2 ordnance workshops evacuated under direct fire. 34 unfinished cutters got loaded onto trucks. 12 cutters already welded to Shermans couldn't be moved fast enough. Engineers destroyed them with thermite grenades to prevent German capture of the design. Weather forecasts for July 25th showed deteriorating conditions. The massive air bombardment supporting Operation Cobra required clear skies. Bradley had one backup date. If weather scrubbed the offensive on the 25th, it would launch on the 26th. That gave ordnance crews potentially 1 extra day. But meteorologists predicted heavy cloud cover on both dates. The offensive might delay to July 27th or beyond. Or Bradley might cancel the massive air support and attack with ground forces alone. By midnight on July 23rd, 406 cutters had been installed. 94 remained. 2 days until the offensive. Workshops operated beyond sustainable capacity. Welders worked until they collapsed. Equipment failures increased as forges ran without maintenance. Steel quality degraded as crews exhausted the best Czech Hedgehog sections and started using damaged obstacles with stress fractures. The 2nd SS Panzer Division moved into defensive positions directly across from the planned Cobra breakthrough sector. Intelligence officers reported 18 Panther tanks, 23 Panzer IV tanks, and 42 anti-tank guns concentrated in a 5-mile stretch between Marigny and St. Gilles. The German defensive line was stronger than it had been in weeks, and every Rhino tank would have to break through that concentration to prove the concept worked in large-scale combat. Tank crews from the 2nd Armored Division began receiving their modified Shermans on the evening of July 23rd. Company commanders conducted brief training sessions in rear areas. Drivers practiced approaching hedgerows at the correct angle and speed. Gunners learned to maintain target acquisition while the prongs tore through roots and earth. Crews discovered the violent shaking during breach made firing accurately almost impossible for the first 3 seconds after breaking through. Nobody knew if the devices would hold up under sustained combat. Nobody knew if German anti-tank gunners had developed effective countermeasures. Nobody knew if 500 Rhino tanks would change the battle or just create 500 expensive targets. But at 0600 on July 24th, weather forecasters confirmed Operation Cobra would launch on July 25th, and 406 Rhino tanks would have to be enough. At 0940 on July 25th, 1944, 1,500 B-17 and B-24 bombers dropped 3,300 tons of explosives on a rectangular corridor northwest of St. Lo. The largest carpet bombing in military history obliterated German defensive positions across 12 square kilometers. Smoke and dust obscured the entire breakthrough sector, and at 10:30, 7 infantry divisions supported by armored battalions began the ground assault for Operation Cobra. The Rhino tanks went in with the second wave at 11:15. Company A of the 2nd Armored Division led with 18 modified Shermans pushing south from Marigny. The first hedgerow stood 14 feet high, with root systems that had stopped conventional tanks for 6 weeks. The lead Rhino hit at 12 miles per hour. The steel prongs dug in. The tank plowed through in 6 seconds and emerged firing. The second Rhino followed, then the third. 18 Shermans breached 18 hedgerows in 4 minutes without a single belly exposure. German anti-tank crews had prepared for conventional tactics. They expected Shermans to climb over hedgerows, exposing their undersides for easy kills. Instead, the Rhinos came through at ground level with guns already traversing toward targets. A Panzer IV positioned to shoot climbing tanks found itself facing a Sherman that appeared through a hedgerow wall at combat speed. The engagement lasted 8 seconds. The Panzer burned. By 1300 hours, Rhino-equipped units had penetrated 3 miles into German defensive depth. Conventional Sherman battalions without cutters advanced only 800 yards in the same period. The difference was measurable in real time. Rhino companies moved cross-country through bocage at speeds the Germans couldn't counter. Every field became passable. Every hedgerow became a doorway instead of an obstacle. The 4th Armored Division committed 97 Rhino tanks to the assault south of Coutances on July 26th. They encountered the heaviest German resistance of the offensive. Panzer Lehr Division had positioned anti-tank guns covering every road junction and gap in the hedgerows. The conventional approach would have funneled American armor into prepared kill zones. Instead, the Rhinos cut new paths through fields the Germans thought impassable. German defensive positions got flanked by tanks appearing from unexpected angles. Culin's original prototype Sherman participated in the breakthrough near Cannacy on July 27th. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron pushed through German lines using 8 Rhino tanks to create breaches for following infantry. Culin's vehicle made 14 separate hedgerow penetrations in 6 hours of combat. The prongs bent but held. The welds showed stress cracks but didn't fail. And the tank survived the day without exposing its belly armor once. By July 28th, American forces had broken through the German defensive crust. The bocage that had consumed 6 weeks and hundreds of tanks was now passable terrain. Rhino-equipped units reached open country south of the hedgerow belt. The 3rd Army activated under General Patton and began the exploitation phase. Armored columns that would have died in the bocage were now racing toward Avranches and the Brittany breakout. Final production counts showed 493 hedgerow cutters completed between July 14th and July 26th, 12 days, not 11, but close enough. Approximately 60% of First Army's medium tanks carried the modification by the time Operation Cobra achieved breakthrough. British forces requested their own version. 600 Mark I prongs arrived from England by August. Another 1,500 Mark II and Mark III variants followed for Sherman and Cromwell tanks. The Bocage campaign had cost First Army over 500 Sherman tanks in 7 weeks. Operation Cobra, supported by Rhino modifications, broke the stalemate in 4 days. American casualties during the breakthrough were severe, but tank losses dropped 40% compared to June and early July averages. The devices worked. The concept proved sound, and German defensive doctrine built around stopping tanks at hedgerows collapsed when the hedgerows stopped being obstacles. But success created new problems nobody had anticipated, and those problems would determine whether Culin's invention was remembered or forgotten. The publicity started immediately. War correspondents filed stories about the Rhino tanks within 48 hours of Operation Cobra's launch. Newsreels showed modified Shermans plowing through hedgerows. Radio broadcasts described the breakthrough, and every report credited Sergeant Curtis Culin as the sole inventor of the device that changed the Normandy campaign. Culin knew the story was incomplete. The concept originated during a conversation with a soldier he barely knew. A Tennessee private everyone called Roberts had suggested mounting sawteeth on tank fronts during a bull session in mid-June. Other men laughed. Culin recognized the potential. He built the prototype, he demonstrated it to Bradley, but the original idea came from Roberts, and Culin insisted on setting the record straight. Army public affairs officers ignored the clarification. The narrative needed a hero. Culin fit perfectly. A sergeant from New Jersey who turned German scrap metal into American victory. Simple, dramatic, promotable. Adding Roberts complicated the story, so Roberts disappeared from official accounts. Culin spent weeks trying to correct the record. Nobody cared about accuracy when the simplified version worked better for morale. The credit dispute revealed a larger problem. Culin wasn't the only American who invented a hedgerow cutter in July 1944. The 79th Infantry Division developed a working cutter by July 5th. The 19th Corps demonstrated prong devices on July 8th. 5th Corps units built brush cutters and green dozers independently. Lieutenant Charles Green of the 7047th Tank Battalion created railroad-tie prongs that worked before Culin welded his first prototype. Multiple invention was common in combat zones. Soldiers facing identical problems developed similar solutions simultaneously. But the Army needed one invention, one inventor, one story. Culin got chosen because his demonstration reached Bradley first. The timing mattered more than the originality. And dozens of other sergeants and lieutenants watched their innovations get credited to someone else. By August, military historians were already questioning the Rhino's actual effectiveness. Stephen Zaloga's later analysis noted the devices were not as widely used as legend suggested. Martin Blumensen's official campaign history stated the cutters restored mobility, but provided little tactical value during the breakout itself, since tanks advanced on roads rather than cross-country. The devices worked, but whether they changed the battle or just changed morale remained disputed. Technical problems emerged as the campaign moved beyond the bocage. The steel prongs added weight and reduced the Sherman's already limited range. They snagged on debris in urban combat. They made fording rivers dangerous by disrupting water flow around the hull. And once American forces reached open terrain in early August, the cutters became obsolete equipment that crews couldn't remove without cutting torches. The 2nd Armored Division removed most Rhino modifications by mid-August. The 4th Armored Division kept theirs through September, but combat reports showed minimal hedgerow engagements after Cobra. British prong production continued in England through autumn, but most devices arrived after Allied units had advanced beyond bocage country. 1,500 cutters got manufactured for terrain that no longer constrained operations. Culin received the Legion of Merit in September for exceptional service. The citation mentioned the hedgerow cutter, but didn't detail its impact. He never received a promotion. Roberts never received official recognition. The other inventors from other divisions got forgotten entirely. And by October, When First Army bogged down in the Hurtgen Forest, facing different obstacles entirely, the Rhino tanks had become a footnote to a campaign that had moved on. On November 23, 1944, Culin stepped on a landmine during operations in the Hurtgen Forest. The explosion severed his right leg below the knee. He survived. Evacuated to England for treatment, then returned to the United States in early 1945. The war continued without him, and the invention that saved hundreds of tanks in July became a historical curiosity by the time Germany surrendered. Curtis Culin returned to civilian life in 1945. He married Bernice Enright that year. They settled in New York City, where he worked as a salesman for Schenley Industries. He walked with a prosthetic leg. He rarely discussed the war, and when people asked about the famous hedgerow cutter, he always mentioned Roberts first. The correction never made it into the history books. The Rhino tanks themselves disappeared quickly after the war. Most devices got cut off Sherman hulls during post-combat refurbishment. The steel went to scrapyards. A few modified tanks survived in museums, but the prongs were often missing or replaced with replicas. The actual battlefield artifacts from July 1944 mostly vanished. What remained was the story, not the hardware. Military analysis of the Normandy campaign treated the Rhino as a minor innovation. The official U.S. Army histories mentioned it briefly. British accounts gave more credit to aerial bombardment and artillery support for the breakthrough. Soviet military doctrine ignored it entirely, focusing instead on massed tank formations in open terrain. The device that correspondents called revolutionary in July became a marginal detail by peacetime, but the legend grew independently of the facts. Eisenhower mentioned Culin by name in a 1961 address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. He described the morale boost when troops learned the hedgerow problem had been solved. Bradley included the Rhino demonstration in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, and Walter Cronkite interviewed Eisenhower about it during the 20th anniversary of D-Day in 1964. The disconnect between historical analysis and popular memory became permanent. Scholars noted the limited tactical impact. Veterans remembered the psychological effect. Tank crews who fought in Normandy swore the Rhinos saved their lives. Historians examining casualty statistics found the correlation weak. Both perspectives were accurate. The device worked, but its importance depended on what question you asked. Culin died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituaries mentioned his war service. Some newspapers recalled the hedgerow cutter. Most readers had forgotten the context. Normandy was 19 years past. Korea had happened. Vietnam was escalating. And a sergeant who welded steel prongs onto tanks seemed like ancient history. His hometown of Cranford, New Jersey, installed a memorial plaque on a boulder outside the municipal building sometime in the 1980s. It credited Culin with the invention that helped break the bocage stalemate. Roberts wasn't mentioned. The other inventors from other divisions weren't acknowledged. The simplified story had won. Modern military historians debate the Rhino's actual contribution to Operation Cobra's success. Max Hastings credited it with restoring Allied battlefield maneuverability. Chester Wilmot called it essential to the breakthrough. Stephen Zaloga argued its effectiveness was exaggerated. Martin Blumenson noted, tanks advanced on roads during Cobra, not through fields. The evidence supports multiple interpretations, depending on which metric matters most. What nobody disputes is the production achievement. 493 functional devices built in 12 days using scrap metal and field-expedient methods. No factory support, no technical specifications, no supply chain. Just welders and steel and the pressure of an approaching offensive. That part of the story remains verifiable, regardless of tactical debates. The museums that display Rhino tanks today use replicas. The original prongs cut from German beach obstacles are gone. The welds Culin made at 0300 on July 14th don't exist anymore. The Sherman he modified probably got scrapped in 1946. Physical evidence of the invention has largely disappeared. What survives is memory. And memory has proven both more durable and less reliable than steel. 80 years later, the story of Sergeant Culin and his pitchfork tanks appears in documentaries, books, and YouTube videos. Some accounts are accurate, many aren't, and nobody can ask Culin to correct the record anymore. He's been dead for 61 years. Roberts has been dead even longer. The men who actually lived this history are all gone now. The question that matters isn't whether the Rhino changed Operation Cobra. The question is, what happens when ordinary soldiers face impossible problems with limited resources and no time? Culin wasn't an engineer. He was a 29-year-old cavalry sergeant who looked at scrap metal and saw a solution. Roberts was a private who made a suggestion everyone else dismissed. And 493 ordnance workers were welders who chose not to sleep for 12 days. Military innovation in 1944 didn't come from laboratories or procurement offices. It came from hedgerow fields where men died climbing earthen banks. It came from watching the 73rd Sherman in your battalion burn because nobody had figured out how to breach without exposing the belly. It came from the certainty that July 25th was coming, whether you were ready or not. The bocage killed hundreds of American tankers between June and July. The Rhino didn't save all of them. Some crews died in modified Shermans. Some died after the breakthrough succeeded. War doesn't offer perfect solutions, but the casualty rate dropped 40% during Cobra compared to the previous 6 weeks. 40% meant hundreds of men who went home instead of burning in Normandy fields. The mathematics of survival are brutal and simple. Culin spent 18 years after the war trying to credit Roberts. He failed. The Army wanted one hero, one story, one lesson. And the lesson the Army chose was that individual initiative could change campaigns. Not collaboration, not multiple invention, not the messy reality of simultaneous solutions emerging from collective desperation. Just one sergeant with a welding torch and an idea. But the real lesson is different. The real lesson is that 11 days mattered. 12 if you count honestly. That's how long it took to go from prototype to 500 operational devices deployed across an army. No bureaucracy, no committees, no feasibility studies. Just Bradley saying build them, and Medeiros saying yes, and 493 people working until the job finished. Modern militaries can't replicate that timeline. Modern procurement requires environmental impact statements and safety reviews and competitive bidding. Those safeguards exist for good reasons, but they guarantee that no future army will ever build 500 of anything in 12 days using scrap metal and expedient welds. That kind of desperate innovation belonged to a specific moment in history, and that moment is gone. What remains is the memory of men who solved an unsolvable problem because the alternative was watching more friends die. Culin welding prongs at 0300 because the demonstration was at 0700. Medeiros ordering round-the-clock shifts because Operation Cobra didn't care about reasonable production schedules. Tank crews learning to breach hedgerows in 4 hours because the offensive launched the next morning. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about sergeants and welders who saved lives with scrap metal and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Curtis Culin doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.